time had become a meaningless concept in the house that grief built. Days melted into nights, and nights stretched into eternities of wakeful terror. I had stopped eating regularly, stopped showering, stopped pretending that the world outside these walls existed. The mirror in the hallway reflected a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, with hair that hung in greasy strands around a face that had aged years in mere weeks. The woman staring back at me was a ghost herself, haunting her own life. The phone calls had stopped, but their absence was somehow worse than their presence. The silence was pregnant with anticipation, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next shoe to drop. I found myself staring at the unplugged landline for hours, willing it to ring, desperate for even the torment of David's voice. The quiet was a vacuum that threatened to swallow me whole. It was Mrs. Patterson from next door who finally broke through my self-imposed isolation. I heard her voice first, muffled through the front door, calling my name with increasing urgency. "Sarah? Sarah, honey, are you in there? I haven't seen you in weeks." The knocking grew more insistent, accompanied by the jingle of keys. David had given her a spare set years ago, back when we were the kind of neighbors who looked out for each other, back when I was the kind of person who answered doors and engaged with the living world. The sound of the key turning in the lock sent a jolt of panic through me. I scrambled from my position on the living room floor, where I had been sitting for God knows how long, and tried to make myself presentable, but there was no hiding what I had become. Mrs. Patterson's gasp when she saw me was like a physical blow. "Oh, dear God, Sarah," she whispered, her weathered hands flying to her mouth. "What has happened to you?" I tried to speak, but my voice came out as a croak. I hadn't used it in days, maybe weeks. "I'm fine," I managed, the lie tasting bitter on my tongue. Mrs. Patterson, a retired nurse with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who had seen too much suffering to be easily fooled, stepped into the house and immediately began taking inventory. The unwashed dishes piled in the sink, the curtains drawn tight against the daylight, the general air of decay and neglect. Her eyes, sharp despite her 70-odd years, missed nothing. "When did you last eat?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. I couldn't remember. Food had become an abstract concept, something other people did. "Yesterday," I lied again. She moved through the house with the efficiency of someone conducting a medical assessment, and I followed her like a lost child. When she reached the living room, she stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on the unplugged phone lying on the floor, its cord coiled around it like a dead snake. Beside it, scattered across the coffee table, were pages and pages of notes I didn't remember writing. My handwriting, but frantic, illegible in places, covering every inch of paper with the same phrases repeated over and over. "He knows, he knows, he knows." Mrs. Patterson said slowly, "Sarah, who knows what?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. How could I explain? How could I tell this kind, rational woman about the calls from beyond the grave, about David's voice reaching across the void to torment me with truths I couldn't bear to face? How could I make her understand that the dead don't rest when the living carry such crushing guilt? I whispered, "The phone, pointing at the lifeless device. "He's been calling me." Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted from concern to something deeper, more troubling. She knelt beside the scattered papers, reading the frantic scrawls with growing alarm. "Sarah, honey, who has been calling you?" "David." The name fell from my lips like a confession. "My husband. He's been calling me." The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Patterson's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, concern, and finally a kind of gentle pity that made me want to disappear entirely. She reached for the phone, examining it with the thoroughness of someone looking for evidence. "Sarah," she said carefully, "this phone has been unplugged for weeks. Look at the dust on the cord. And the phone company, they disconnected your landline service last month. I saw the notice on your door." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the phone, at the dust she was right about, at the disconnection notice I had no memory of seeing. The room began to spin, reality tilting on its axis. If the phone had been disconnected, if it had been unplugged for weeks, then how? "That's impossible," I breathed. "I've been talking to him. He's been calling me every night." Mrs. Patterson's hand found mine, warm and solid and real, in a way that nothing had felt real for so long. "Sarah, I think you need help, professional help. This grief, this isolation, it's playing tricks on your mind." But even as she spoke, even as the rational part of my brain tried to accept her explanation, I could feel it, the presence, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the shadows. David was here, in this room, listening to every word. And he was angry, so very angry. Mrs. Patterson, true to her word, didn't leave my side. She became my anchor in a sea of madness, a lifeline to a reality I had all but abandoned. She cleaned the house, cooked me meals I had no appetite for, and, most importantly, she listened. She listened to my frantic, disjointed stories of the calls, of David's voice, of the chilling details he knew. She didn't dismiss me, didn't treat me like a madwoman, but her eyes held a deep, unwavering concern that was more terrifying than any accusation. At her gentle but firm insistence, I agreed to see a therapist, a kind-faced woman named Dr. Evans, who specialized in grief counseling. I went through the motions, answered her questions, but my heart wasn't in it. How could I explain to this stranger the supernatural terror that had taken root in my life? How could I make her understand that this was more than just grief? It was a haunting. It was Mrs. Patterson who suggested we get the phone records. "Just to be sure," she said, her voice carefully neutral, to rule out any possibility of a prank or a crossed wire. I agreed, a part of me desperate for any rational explanation, any lifeline to sanity. The other part of me, the part that knew the truth, recoiled in terror. What if the records showed nothing? What would that mean for my already fragile grasp of reality? The phone company, after some bureaucratic wrangling, finally sent the records. I stared at the envelope for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. Mrs. Patterson sat with me, her hand a comforting weight on my shoulder. With trembling fingers, I tore it open. The records were a stark black and white testament to my isolation. No incoming calls, not a single one. The only outgoing calls were to my mother, my sister, and a few clients, all made in the first few weeks after David's death. The landline had been silent, a dead artery in the heart of my home. I stared at the paper, the words blurring through my tears. It was true. It was all in my head. The calls, the voice, the chilling details, all a product of my own broken mind. The relief was so profound it was almost painful, a wave of sanity washing over me, cleansing the cobwebs of fear and paranoia. But then, a new, more insidious fear began to creep in. If I had imagined all of that, what else was I capable of imagining? What other horrors lurked in the depths of my own psyche? It was then that Mrs. Patterson pointed to a single, unfamiliar number on the bill, an outgoing call made on the night of the accident, just minutes before David had left the house. My blood ran cold. I knew that number. It was Mark's. "Who is this, Sarah?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice gentle. I couldn't speak. The memory of that call, the one I had buried so deep, came rushing back with a vengeance. The fight with David, his angry words, my desperate call to Mark, seeking solace, seeking validation. And then the screech of tires, the sickening crunch of metal, the sudden, deafening silence. "It was a friend," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "An old friend," but the lie tasted like ash in my mouth. It wasn't just a friend. It was more complicated than that. Mark had been my confidant, my emotional crutch, the one I turned to when my marriage to David had started to crumble under the weight of unspoken resentments and simmering frustrations. There had been nothing physical between us, but the emotional affair had been a betrayal nonetheless. A betrayal that had, in a way, led to David's death. That night, after Mrs. Patterson had gone home, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went online. I looked up Mark's name, my fingers trembling as I typed. His social media profile was a ghost town. His last post, a cryptic message from the day after the accident. Some things can never be undone. I dug deeper, my search becoming more frantic. I found a news article, a small local report about a man who had been found dead in his apartment, a suspected suicide. The date was 3 days after David's accident. The man's name was Mark. My world tilted on its axis. Mark was dead. He had been dead all this time. The calls, they couldn't have been from him. The voice, it had been David's. But the details, the things he knew, only Mark could have known some of them. The things I had confessed to him in hushed, desperate calls. The things I had never told another soul. My mind reeled, trying to piece together the impossible. David's voice, Mark's knowledge. A chilling, terrifying thought began to form in my mind, a thought so monstrous I could barely give it shape. What if it wasn't David calling me? What if it was something else? Something that had taken David's voice, but was feeding on my guilt, my secrets, my deepest fears. Something that had used Mark's knowledge to torment me, to push me to the brink of madness. The house was no longer just haunted by David. It was haunted by something far older, far more malevolent, something that had been drawn to my grief, my guilt, my despair. And It was hungry. So very, very hungry. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't David. It was never David. It was something that had latched on to my grief, a parasitic entity feeding on my guilt, twisting my memories and using the voices of the dead to drive me to the brink. The phone records, Mark's death, they were undeniable proof. The calls had been a delusion, a carefully constructed nightmare woven from my deepest fears and regrets. But if it was a delusion, why did it feel so real? Why did the house still feel heavy with an unseen presence? Why did the shadows still seem to writhe in my peripheral vision? The entity, whatever it was, had become so intertwined with my psyche that it was almost impossible to separate reality from the terror it had meticulously crafted. I stood in the center of the living room, the unplugged landline still lying on the floor like a discarded toy. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with a low, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, to push back against the encroaching madness. I had to confront it. I had to reclaim my mind. "You're not real," I whispered, my voice trembling but firm. "You're a lie, a parasite." The hum intensified, a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The air grew cold, a biting chill that seeped into my bones. A faint, distorted whisper slithered into my ears, a cacophony of voices, all of them familiar, all of them accusing. David's voice, Mark's voice, even my own, twisted and malevolent. "You wished me gone, Sarah. You wished me gone. You betrayed me, Sarah. You betrayed us both. You're a monster, Sarah. A murderer." I clutched my head, the voices a tormenting symphony of my deepest fears. This was it. This was the final push, the entity's last desperate attempt to shatter my sanity completely. But something had shifted within me. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mixed with a burning rage. Rage at the entity for its cruelty, rage at myself for allowing it to consume me. "No," I screamed, my voice echoing through the empty house. "I loved him. I loved David, and I grieved for him. My guilt, it's mine, not yours to twist and exploit." As I spoke, the cold intensified, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to coalesce into indistinct forms. I saw David, his face contorted in a silent scream, his eyes accusing. I saw Mark, his face pale and drawn, his lips moving in a silent condemnation. They were projections, I knew, figments of my tormented mind, but they felt terrifyingly real. "You want my guilt?" I snarled, tears streaming down my face, but my voice was strong now, filled with a newfound resolve. "Take it all, but you will not take my sanity. You will not take me." I walked towards the unplugged landline, the source of so much of my torment. The air around it shimmered, and the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the entity was fighting back, desperate to maintain its hold. I picked up the phone, its plastic cold and lifeless in my hand. It was just an object,
a conduit for my own self-inflicted torture. With a guttural cry, I raised the phone and brought it down with all my might against the floor. Once, twice, again, and again, until the plastic casing cracked and splintered, the wires exposed, the internal mechanics crushed. Each blow was a release, a shattering of the illusion, a defiant act against the entity that had preyed on my vulnerability. As the phone lay in pieces, the hum in the house began to recede. The coldness lessened, and the shadows, though still present, no longer seemed to writhe with malevolent intent. The cacophony of voices in my head faded, replaced by a profound, almost overwhelming silence. It was the silence of a battle won, a war waged within the confines of my own mind.
The days that followed were a slow, arduous climb back to the light. Mrs. Patterson was a constant, unwavering presence, her quiet support a balm to my wounded soul. I continued therapy with Dr. Evans, and this time I was honest. I laid bare my guilt, my fears, the terrifying delusions that had consumed me. It was a painful process, but with each confession, each shared burden, the weight on my shoulders lessened. I never heard the phantom calls again. The house, once a tomb of my grief, slowly began to feel like a home again. I started to clean, to open the curtains, to let the sunlight stream in, chasing away the lingering shadows. I went back to my work, and this time the colors were vibrant again, reflecting a renewed sense of purpose. The haunting, I realized, had not been a supernatural entity from beyond the grave. It had been my own guilt, my own unresolved grief, manifesting in a terrifying, tangible form. David's voice, Mark's knowledge, they were echoes of my own conscience, twisted and amplified by my isolation and despair. The phone, unplugged and disconnected, was merely a focal point for my internal torment. I still missed David. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my heart, but it was no longer a suffocating shroud. It was a part of me, a testament to the love we had shared, and a reminder of the lessons I had learned. I accepted my part in the tragedy, not as a murderer, but as a flawed human being who had made a mistake that had led to unimaginable consequences. But I also accepted that I deserved to heal, to live, to find peace. One sunny afternoon, I sat on the porch, a cup of tea in my hand, watching Mrs. Patterson tend to her roses. The air was crisp, the birds were singing, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of calm. The haunting was over. The call from beyond the grave had been a call from within, a desperate plea from my own fractured soul. And I had finally answered it. I was still Sarah Chen, but I was no longer haunted. I was finally free.
Subscribe to be the first to get a notification when the next video drops, and hit the like button for more tales. Thank you.